In this episode, we speak with Chris Bach, the co-founder of Netlify, a platform for developers to build highly performant and dynamic websites, e-commerce stores, and applications. In 2015, Chris and his team saw that the web would be endlessly more performant, secure, and scalable if it would move off the traditional monoliths to a new decoupled architecture. By uniting an extensive ecosystem of technologies, services, and APIs into one workflow, Netlify unlocks new levels of team productivity while saving time and money. Netlify has raised over $200 million from Andreessen Horowitz, Bessemer, Bond, EQT, and other notable investors. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought we could kick off with your current focus with Netlify and maybe tell the audience how it came to be, how the idea came about, and what made you decide to embark on this new company. Well, it's now not new, but then it was new.
Absolutely. So I'm originally from Copenhagen, Denmark. Came out of film, went into advertisement via digital, and I had left film behind and was chief digital officer at an SI in Denmark. When my good friend from high school, who was already in Silicon Valley, reached out to me and talked about sort of a need for a new underlying architecture for the web. So regardless of you was using one piece of software in order to build it, sort of the architectural premise underneath. And he was seeing a lot of sort of proof that we were heading in another direction, away from the traditional way of building, where it was very much a monolith. That means one piece of software doing everything. He was sort of saying, hey, we're going to get to this more sort of decoupled approach where, just like on a mobile phone, right? You don't download the app of Spotify every time you use it. You download it separately, and then from somewhere else, you'll stream the music, right? And it was more sort of splitting things up on the web could really lead to solve a lot of the things that I thought were the premise of doing business online. Like, for example, there were a bunch of security issues because code was running in the open all the time. And there was a bunch of scalability issues because you had that one bottleneck. You essentially had back in the day to build a version of your website for every single, that's how it worked. And then lastly, it was slow, right? Like, you had performance issues and so on. And the more I dove into this, the more I could see that we could do something about the underlying architecture. And if we did, it would solve these growing concerns around scalability and security and so on. But I also could see that it would be a whole ecosystem, right? Because if you decouple it, then let's say you want e-commerce. Well, great, but the existing e-commerce providers, they're only going to be providing a traditional monolith, right? They need to exist in what you call a headless version or sort of a standalone API version. And the same again for content management and a bunch of other things. And then you would need a brand new way of thinking about how do all those pieces fit together and actually output websites or apps or stores at the end of the day. And we figured we could bring the platform to life. And then the incentives to building in this new way would be big enough that an ecosystem would come. It was basically sort of a bet. Mm-hmm. So it was both a bet that we could make a company out of it, but it was also very much a bet that we could grow category. Mm-hmm. And back then there was us and maybe one or two others in this space. And today it really has become, right? Like there's thousands of companies. We're not alone. And you can build any digital solution today with these best-in-class components. You don't have to go to like a singular provider. But yeah, the original idea was really like quite literally, we need a better web.
Mm-hmm. And did you view it then as particularly risky, or was there an easy way to kind of test it out?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, I had to leave a cushy job and go to the most expensive city in the world at that point without a salary. Like that part was kind of risky, right? I had a family that I brought with me, but what my co-founder had done an MVP, of course, not of the entire product, but of some of it. And so I could, because I had clients back then, of course, like I could test it out, but it was the workflow was completely unviable. The results were really lightweight and I could test that, right? Even if it was results that back then had limited functionality, because as I said, there was no ecosystem, right? You could sort of see that this would be better. That's not a great way to get there right now, but if there was, this would be better. And so the other thing, which I spend a lot of time on also when I sit with, if I'm in angel investing or something, or if I sit on an advisory board or whatever, is this notion of like really identifying your initial key audience, right? And so we spend a bunch of time of who wants to do this, even if it's smaller projects, right? Is it the right developers, right? Is it the trend? Is it the ones that know, right? And the more we looked at it, the more it was exactly the right type of developers that were trying to embrace this. They were just doing it for blogs, right? It wasn't because they were out there preaching that this was going to be the way the web was built, right? But they were engaging, right? And they did like it. And I think the more we spoke to, the more like they saw the potential, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those were the two things that were the indicators that this could work. But it's always kind of a moonshot if you build a company like this, right? But it became a double so because we were also depending on, even if we built the greatest product in the world, like we can't, it would be like, imagine GitHub,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no use of Git, right? That becomes a little challenging, right? Best product in the world, right? But if people aren't going that way, then never mind. And so I think for us, it was really trying to map out if people were doing this approach that we were talking about, what else would happen at scale. I think a lot of times founders don't really think about in case of success, but I think that's really important. And you're saying, what is that? And that's how we mapped out what an ecosystem would have to look like, because people will need this and enterprises need this. And then from that worldview, we reversed engineered it back to where we were today. And that's how we figured out what we should go and build and what we should let clients do themselves and what we should sort of bet on and try to encourage an ecosystem to come up and build.
And I believe you have 5 million developers using your platform. Now, if we were to take that and break it out into segments, what would be like the biggest segment? Speaking to about your audience, which segments of your audience do you find value the platform the most?
Well, it doesn't change as such over time, but it does, right? And what I mean by that is in the very beginning, you can either really self-architect things or you can just build fairly simple use cases. So these are developers. They might work as principal engineers somewhere in a large tech corporation, but they're building out their blog. And it was a typical bottom-up approach. But that was what success looked like for us. Not revenue, but how many developers want to have this in their tool belt. But it was also because there wasn't really a good enterprise use case yet, right? And then that comes with time. As the ecosystem flourishes, now you can start using this, right? So I would say in that segment, in the beginning, it was developers. Then they took us to work, right? Like, they bring us into a company and they talk about it at lunch and they convince an engineering manager that, hey, can I deploy this to Netlify? It's interesting. It's just like an internal documentation site, whatever it might be, right? And then we grow from there and we can reach out and saying, hey, do you need an SLA? And like, the typical bottom-up enterprise play, right? But that's developer first. I think what today has happened is also now you have different stakeholders, right? You have marketers, you have business stakeholders that sit and aren't deeply involved in the tech, but still drive like very large digital solutions. And those are the ones that we're also helping now. And so I think developers are still the ones that are using the product directly.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're building with it is very different, right? And now we're just as much talking to enterprise architects that are trying to say, I'm not looking at building a small headless project. I'm saying our organization have to embrace a composable architecture if we want to be agile enough at scale. In order to do that, we have to lean into big time automation because we can't keep doing operations as usual. And then that's the starting point for the conversation. And that's, of course, very, very different. But that's also because we can now accommodate completely different use cases, right? But we still have tons of developers coming in and in 30 seconds deploying their very first website and they're super happy, right? And that's great. Like that's where the journey starts. I always I came from advertisement, so I've dealt with all these different audiences. And I'm always amazed. Let's say you were selling medical supplies, right? Like someone that's just considering starting med school is probably not like a great target audience. It's going to be like 15 years before they even have influence on buying anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But developers, right here, I mean, you see them at a meetup and they're like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about code school. And then 2 years later, they're like a senior developer at LinkedIn or something, right? Like it's pretty cool. The turnaround is so quick, right? It's all about not where you're from or anything, but can you code? And like, can you do it contextually in the right way? And do you do it fast enough, right? And I think that's really cool.
The scenario that you described where it was like just an individual developer on his or her own building their site, then they go into their company and they start talking about it. Do you remember that first time where there was that lead in and it was actually like a pretty big company?
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's a number of them, right? But yeah, There were some great ones. There was this grassroots political movement, right? And then they had built something there, and they were building all the websites for all their candidates. And then they reached out to us, and it was just Matt and I, right? We were selling dedicated account managers, but I was just making up voices like, Chris, yeah, hold on, this is Chris. They're like, you all have the same accent. No, we don't. Like, and I was like, maybe we should raise some money because we need some more people here, right? And they were like, so what would it be like if we had like 1,600 like different sites and instances? And like, let me get back to you on that, right? Sort of like, it's very much, it's a cliche, right? But you really are building the plane midair, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you just figure that stuff out as you go along, right? And then constantly sort of double back and seeing, are they deriving the right value for it? And then, yeah, it was evolving from then on, right? And it's the same time, the first time you get your 6-figure deals or whatever it is, right? Like those milestones are always fantastic, right? But I also try to stop, like, say, are they getting 6 figures worth of value? Because if not, then this is not repeatable. And then there's not that much to celebrate yet, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
it's when you feel the motion is working and they're paying whatever it is and they're getting more than that value out of it, right? Like it's really good. It's a win for them as well, right? That's when you feel like you nailed it.
Yeah, pricing is always a difficult thing,
Oh,
especially in the early days. How did you go about figuring out the right price for the platform?
I mean, I'm tempted to say we didn't, right? Because like if there's any entrepreneurs listening out here, right, especially early stage, you're like, oh, we have to nail pricing. I think what I learned is that you never do. Like it's a constant change and evolvement, right? I think what you want to try to figure out, and what's most important is the model, right? Like, so is it a freemium? And do we have a self-service? Well, is that self-serve just lead qualification for enterprise? That means it's a way of them raising their hand, of us vetting out who's worth reaching out to and trying to get to an enterprise client. But the real revenue that will matter at all is going to come once they're an enterprise client, which is complete touch sales. So, or is the self-service something where you're saying, no, that's real revenue. That's what we'll depend on. We'll have enterprise clients, but this is a motion that really needs to make financial sense for us in and to itself. Like those kinds of understanding what you want to do with the model and what it needs to support. And because that also, I mean, it really should inform your product roadmap. I actually think if you're doing software as a service, that was one of the first things I had to learn was that, you see all this traffic to your pricing page, right? It's something like 60% on average. And I think it's a lot more at early stage companies because there's not a lot of brand awareness either of traffic to your pricing page is to understand the product. So easiest way to get is what are they charging for? That explains the value of the product. That's how I should commercialize it. And is it for developers? Is it for non? Like all those things I actually answer quite well by a pricing page very often, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean. Like the model, the story, the customer journey, those are the things that you really want to get right. And then whether you should have that one more feature or this one more feature, right? Or it should be $19 or $29 and all these things. That will be experiment that will change throughout. The one mantra there is just that don't screw anyone over, right? Like grandfather, grandfather, grandfather. And then you're building for large success. So yes, you have to grandfather something, but just think of it this way. 99% of it is ahead of you. At least that's how we thought about it, right? And you won't always get it right, right? But that's how I think about it. I by no means consider myself a pricing and packaging expert, right? But it's much more detrimental and it'll hold you up a lot more if you're not sure of should this be a freemium model? Should we have trials? Should we not, right? Like those are things that matter a lot more to the kind of audience you're reaching, how you want to reach them. Are you building an enterprise product that's very expensive but have fewer clients, or are you trying to get them to the masses and so on? Like understanding basically monetization is much more important than trying to get exactly pricing and packaging right, because that's hard to do anyway, right? And that will change.
Did you have situations where you thought of, or you and your team thought of features? So we know the user, this is going to be very valuable to them. They're
Of
going to
course.
really pay up for it, but it doesn't pan out.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Lots of those. Lots of those. I was just thinking right now, I'm just remembering the ones that did ban it. Like, for example, I remember very early, we had geo IP redirects. So if you're from Japan, you'll see a Japanese version of a website, right? And having that on the edge. So there's no lag, there's no delay at all. Like you get that fed as fast as you would anything else. There's not the white clamps and so on. That was pretty groundbreaking at that point, right? Like, because normally you had a performance overhead and that caused conversion rates. And ours way didn't. But at the same time, no one building a blog needs GRP redirects. Like that's not a thing, right? You don't have language-based versions. Like you just have your blog, right? And so Those are the ones that are easier to say, well, that's going to be an enterprise feature, right? There's a lot of the other ones where you feel like, okay, especially if it's new functionality, right?
Hmm.
So serverless is obviously a big thing today, right? And on its way to just like merging into a database model, really, right? But it was sort of like this notion of saying, hey, I don't have to spin up a database. I could just run a little bit of function each time. It's much easier. And everyone was talking about it in our environment of front end and websites and so on, but very few people were doing it. And we thought about, well, the first idea is that this is because there's not the right frameworks out there. It's brand new. Let's go and do something. And then more we looked at that, it's like, I don't think so. And also, I'm not sure that we want to compete with AWS on that one. Like, that doesn't seem like where we should be anyway. And we sort of ended up just having a very, very simple realization is that the reason that people aren't adopting it is because it's hard. That's it. Like, you have your control. That's in a Git environment. I have my front end code and all these things. And then you have serverless and it runs out here and is away from everything. And it's not going to be part of your continuous deployment. It's just hard, right? And syncing it and setting up the microservice gateway back then was like awful for these different services, right? And it was just really difficult. That's why it wasn't happening. And then for our audience of front-end developers that used to just cut up Photoshop files and turn them into HTML. So they were still also learning how to really do full stack now that they could. And then we just found out that if we just integrate it into Git, so you just put your serverless code in a folder like everything else and push it to Git like you would normally, then hey, that little function meant that it became easy because you just plugged it into an existing workflow rather than add something on you. It's the same code and everything else, right? And then we ran that, in this case, Lambda instance for you. And that was the insight. But okay, now we know how to make it easy, but who will use it? Is this only going to be for heavy enterprise? Are developers going to like fall over this, right? And just use it for the individual blocks and so on, right? And I think in the beginning, we thought it would be for everyone, like it's so easy. I'm just going to do everything with serverless, right? The reality is there wasn't very much experimentation from it, but the value gain for these enterprise developers was really big. So they were the ones leaning in immediately. So we shifted up there. And then later on, we saw, oh, now it's becoming standard. Now everyone's doing it. So we had to shift it around a few times. So where do you access that part of Netlify, right? And that part of our product. But yeah, and today it's like completely default. That's how you use serverless, is you push it to Git. And so now, of course, it would just be this is table stakes, right? You put that in your freemium in every tier. But yeah, back then it wasn't as obvious, right? So
I meant to ask you earlier when you mentioned you're from Denmark. Denmark is known as one of the happiest places on earth. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
You asked someone that has an opinion on this, so I'll share it with you, right? So my opinion is that the way they ask these questions, right? Happiness is more translates into contentness. Like most people, when you have these lifestyle things, right? They answer, but they think the answer should be. We can't help ourselves as humans, right? And so in Denmark, there's very much status in saying I'm content. That means that, hey, I kind of made it. Like I'm good enough. Like, hey, I'm not sad that I don't have that higher promotion because I like this one. It's fine, right? The status in being content. Whereas if you go to the US, if I ask someone like the same question, what they sort of take away from is like, they say, yeah, I'm content. So, okay, so you don't want your kids to go to a better college. Fine. Like, so this is enough. Like your family doesn't deserve better. Like it's almost insulting to ask someone like that. No, of course. No. I'm driving. I'm super ambitious. Of course. No. I have an idea for an app, right? And so I think it's much more that mentality, to be quite honest, right? There's a very different drive here. However, I also think that this drive comes from in the US, and I think I can say this without being political, but there is definitely much more of a risk of falling through the cracks. There's not the same welfare system, right? Healthcare is not free in the same way. Education is not free in the same way, and so on. And Denmark is a much smaller country. It's only 5-6 million people, and it's like Brooklyn, right? But anyway, the social welfare is very different, right? So you're not in the same way at risk of falling through, so to speak, the net masks of the society, right? And I think that is a main difference, right? I think they are more destitute people here.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that the happiness one has a little bit to do what status looks like in those two different countries, right? And as an entrepreneur, that American sort of spirit of saying, let's go, right? Like we want to make an impact. We want to change everything, right? It's very inspiring. Like there's a reason I'm here as well, right? Like sky's the limit. And there's a lot of people here really, really wanting to make a dent. And I very much appreciate that, right? That's really good. But when we ask broader, when it's more sort of like the whole society, right? I think there's other dynamics that come into play.
Hmm. We're entering the tail end of the conversation, but before I ask my final two questions, what insights would you share with other entrepreneurs about the keys to building and scaling a company?
I mean, there's so many, right? But pick a few things, right? I think the ones that I see start something because they're just motivated by gold at the end of the rainbow, right? Like I'm trying to pick an idea that can make me rich. I'm sure it works for some people. My general observation is that I haven't really seen it pan out.
Hmm.
But the ones that are saying, especially the ones that are feeling a problem and have an idea for how to solve it much better, that means that they have a real deep felt understanding of the problem that needs to be solved for. And they also have an idea that's pretty solid that there's not a solution right now that works for it, right? That's a much better starting point, right?
Hmm.
So at the very least, like sort of the motivation for it, right? I also think choosing the right co-founder, but it's also very personal for me. I like being back to back with someone else. I wouldn't want to be a solo founder of a large company, right? But I also think that that working relationship is very much a marriage, right? You really have to understand how to get along. And that works often best if you have a symbiosis going. That means that you are not good at the same things the other person is at, right? Right. But also that you're both coming into it with an awareness of what do you really bring to the table and what are you going to need to supplement, right? Because I think that the notion that you have to do everything is not the right one. I think
Hmm.
it's much better to understand like where do you need the help, and that's part of hiring in. And if you feel like that is an area where you just don't know enough, right? When your founder's not going to cover enough of it and you need to hire the rest, then it's probably because it's the wrong field and you should try to do a startup in another area, right? So those are all the most before getting started ones. And I think
Hmm.
like if you are getting started, then there's also like a long list, right? For example, is this a category play? It was in our case, right? Which meant that there was so much of the early go-to-market that had to do with the category rather than profiling our own company, right? That's a whole discipline to itself, right? That we could do more than one episode on, right?
Right.
But like there's a million things, right? Like you do things that don't necessarily scale in the beginning, and that's fine as well, right? I think it's not so much in the US, but I think sometimes if you're in a smaller market, like in Denmark, for example, we have a tendency to execute locally. Like it's just who we are. We can talk about the grand vision, but when I go to work tomorrow, I'm going to look around, and if I'm selling something, we sell through networks and so on. And if there's local and in a small area, there's 5 million people in Denmark, there's 333 million in the US, but it doesn't take, 60 times longer to saturate a US market than a Danish market, right? That's not one-to-one, not even close. And so very often, if you are doing, especially software as a service, now we're not doing local production, we are doing something with a global audience. And if we don't reach that global audience, we won't win our category.
Hmm.
Then you have to think about this early, and it's not enough having it as a vision. It should be mirrored and reflected in what you do from early on,
Hmm.
right? And so I think like this way you have to be much more intentional, because if you execute locally in Silicon Valley where I'm at, everyone here is big tech, right? It's all here, right? A
Hmm.
local execution is almost by default a global one, but
Hmm.
not in these smaller markets where you really have to look up, right? And you really have to be much more intentional in reaching out and building an international network or whatever it might be. Otherwise, you're going to be in a significant disadvantage later on, in my opinion.
Last two questions. Can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
So many. I had a high school teacher, and I have ADHD, but I was diagnosed late in life, right? And I think he had that as well. But he would jump around, and he was so enthusiastic. Like he was like, tasting the words, and he was just like talking about, I think it was geography and biology. And when he talked about these things, he was just like, isn't this amazing? And he would constantly jump around. And a bunch of the others thought he was really confusing, right? And for me, I was like, this is amazing. I'm having fun for the first time in school. I love this. I knew all about plate tectonics and stuff like that. And what I learned from that was how to learn. I was like,
Hmm.
okay, that's how I learn. So I'm not just gonna, read a textbook because someone told me to, and then that. I need the social interaction. I need passion and enthusiasm, and those are gonna be my drivers, right? And so my whole adult working life, I constructed in a way where I could apply that, right? And so I'm not great at doing boring tasks, but I'm pretty okay at finding ways of making boring tasks exciting, right? By providing a different angle on them and doing them together with people that find them super amazing and stuff like that. So I think like that person taught me how I learn.
Excellent. Last question. Can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
So many, right? I am actually leaning into climate tech these days, right? It's also been, a decade with Netlify now, and we have a fantastic team there, right? And so I'm dedicating more of my time today into climate tech, right? And I think the reasoning here is pretty obvious, right? It's important,
Hmm.
one planet, all that. I also find it super fascinating because I learned so much. It's a brand new area. And then the market mechanic, it's just so different than software. Just the fact that there's a tangible output and so on is fun, right? But you're not just learning from a product or engineering point of view, a different sales organizations, how you do that is super different, right? But the whole dynamics of the entire market is different than what I'm used to, right? So there's so much to learn, and I'm really passionate about leaning into it. But as far as the beneficial, sort of in a wider way, impact of this, it is because climate tech and figuring out how to be better at limiting CO2 emissions, for example, right, or storing it underground and all these things is incredibly important for our joint survival.
Hmm. Very cool. Well, Chris, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you again for spending some time with us and sharing some insights. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much for having me again. I appreciate it.